Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you at the virtual conference. I'm looking forward to presenting our paper on using models in realist research. Just like to say that this was an idea originally conceived by my colleague Peter, and together with Cara and Sonia, we developed it as a roundtable discussion. So whilst it's a presentation today, I do invite you to critically reflect on the models that you've seen used in realist research, thinking about their strengths and limitations as we go through the presentation. So we're going to start with a little bit of realist philosophy, for which I give no apology, and then move on to look at how models have been used in realist research to date. I'm going to highlight a few areas of caution and some potential strengths for realist models, and then think about future directions. So cracking on with starting with a bit of realist philosophy, and we do think it's important to start here just because there are quite a lot of emerging approaches that are associated with realist research, and sometimes it's a good idea to just start back at the beginning to underscore what the philosophy of science really was saying and to define the terms that we're going to be using today. So starting with Bhaskara's possibility of naturalism, where he contended that social phenomena can be seen as real entities, not least because they have real effects on the world, but only some of those are empirically observable. Take, for example, the stigma that might be associated with sexual health. It's not something that can be seen itself, but its presence can be felt in the decisions that people make. For example, where they might place a sexual health service in a discrete part of town, or what they might call it, something a little obscure like the Helena Bodmin Centre. So you might argue that stigma has an effect, even if nobody's identified it as being there. So what's actually going on here? So underneath what we can observe, the empirical layer, there are real powers and liabilities that are existing in entities, and when those powers and liabilities are triggered under certain circumstances, then we call that a mechanism that produces an effect. And whilst there are no universal laws that govern exactly how those mechanisms behave in all circumstances, there are patterns that emerge, and we can say that this allows for the possibility of social science. So our endeavours to understand those patterns mean that we're searching for enduring mechanisms that bind some but not other events together and exist in the power of things. Going back to my example of the sexual health service and the stigma associated with it, we can say that the stigma is a cultural entity, and that when we see the patterns of where sexual health services are placed or what they are called, then we can develop theories and models that explain and point to the underlying properties of the cultural stigma. So what we can say is that whilst we can't see these intransitive social phenomena, we experience them through our senses, and therefore they're always flawed and a partial view of the social phenomena under inquiry. And then we endeavour to represent those ideas and models and theories in order to be able to document them. But these are transitive objects of science in which they are dependent on our identification, and as our knowledge deepens, they're subject to change. So given that, what do we actually use models for in realist research? What I'm going to present now is just a selection of those purposes, and they specifically relate to the realist element of research and evaluation. Of course, often we use models to depict programme components, but that's not unique to realist research, so I'm leaving that from this presentation today. So first of all, I'll take Pawson and Tilley's classic. This example is actually taken from Pawson's Causation for Beginners paper in 2008, representing the underlying nature of reality, and indeed the location of the causal explanation. So in other words, that it's not a matter of one element or a combination of elements asserting an influence on the outcome, rather it's the association of the whole that is needed to be explained. We also see a second purpose in realist research where models are used to highlight potential areas of explanation. This is a really complex example here, which maps the theoretical methodological terrain for knowledge translation in healthcare. And the map models social, cultural, material contexts to explain why knowledge alone isn't sufficient to change practice. But what it doesn't do, nor does it intend to do, is explain the necessary and or sufficient causes of what knowledge translation are. And next we move on to a model which is probably familiar to many of you, and that's from Dawkins' 2015 paper, which is starting to illustrate programme theories or explanatory accounts. And here what the model is doing is showing the relationship between items of interest in the study. This particular example shows the relationship between unpredictable illness trajectories and anxiety in registering people as appropriate for palliative care, which is leading to underrepresentation of non-cancer illnesses in palliative care. Here we have a model which was co-produced by myself and Cara Danks and Sonia Dawkin with stakeholders in the northeast of England who are trying to support a whole systems approach to physical activity. In this case, the model is actually trying to explain the process of change by which stakeholders may get on board and work on behalf of the social movement for physical activity. And so we have in the yellow arrow here the stages through which they may progress through getting on board with the vision, valuing that vision and working towards the vision, and the support and the ways of working between the stakeholders that might achieve it, as well as providing a reminder of the inhibitory or facilitative context which support each of those phases. And the final model that I'm going to introduce in this part of the presentation here is a use of a physical model which I used in an early stage of a programme which was supporting community organisations to facilitate physical activity with their communities. And here we actually produced a 3D interactive model of an initial 2D model, which you can see in the screen at the back of the picture here. The 3D model enabled people to really interact with the different parts of the system. So the tables were used to identify features of the system, institutions and organisations. The strings were meant to illustrate the connection between them, the influences and the positive and the negative influences. And the items which you can see in paper were nascent theory elements that talked about the context and mechanisms for change. And this model was actually utilised to enable non-academics to actually conceptualise the interactions in a more physical way and move in and in between the different tables to see different people's perspectives. What we actually uncovered was, if you can see in the bottom left-hand corner here, that the weight of constraints were in the community sector itself, and through the workshop that we delivered, it was identified this was a priority for action moving forward. So what we've aimed to do is to illustrate a selection of models and purposes of using models in realist research, that is to depict the underlying reality, to illustrate potential areas for explanatory accounts, to actually identify how different parts of the system may join up to provide an explanation of what's actually happening underneath the surface, and also to engage stakeholders in theorising. But what we aim to do now is to critically reflect on the use of models, both the ones we've displayed and also others, in our ability to undertake scientific inquiry of social phenomena. So we start with one area of reflection in questioning, are we actually depicting generative causation, or is it feasible to do so? A couple of questions to ask yourself is, do the models only include empirical variables, and do they attempt to, or in fact explain the arrows that link different parts of the model together? No matter how sophisticated, it's likely that most of these models are only really depicting a series of events, and they don't always provide an explanation of why these events are linked. One of the fundamental tenets of realist research is that we are aiming to explain outcome patterns. They're highly conditional, and often what triggers the inquiry itself. But really, in order to do that, the explanation should involve or attend to complex sequences, perhaps comparisons between contexts and the interrelationships between different elements. It's very hard to depict that in a model itself. And a second area of caution here is that do the models leave room for ambiguity? Just to highlight a quote here from Weber, focus in here, and the temptation is to focus too much on input-output relationships, on linear chains of causality, and on building tightly knit models of arrows and boxes. And it just highlights that when we actually commit to a model, especially in a 2D format, then it appears to be closed, even if we don't intend it to be so. The third area of caution that we wanted to raise today is are we being clear about our perspective? What we mean by this is that the potential range of things that could be studied to explain any phenomena is potentially endless, and eventually the ones that are chosen are often the function of the researchers' ideas and theories. And particularly with a model, it seems to fix the criteria that researchers use to explain certain phenomena. And so what was interesting when we did the 3D model was that actually it became so apparent that different people's perspectives would focus on different elements and describe and try to explain different mechanisms. So we're asking, does the model fix the criteria, and should the perspective be made explicit? And should the model be open to different perspectives, or should the researchers be open to different perspectives and be clear about what perspective the model is actually depicting? But clearly models have some fantastic strengths in realist research. The first to highlight would be around the strength of the model as a boundary object. So by that I mean an arrangement or a shared space that allows different groups of work together based on the work of STAR, and provides opportunity for different groups of people to work without necessarily having to have exactly the same perspective on something, but to be able to work productively on generating and developing deeper understanding of something. So the model that we use here in South Tees is really a way of illustrating complex ideas, co-produced with stakeholders, and used for different purposes. They use it to help guide their work, and we use it to help develop ever more nuanced explanations of what is going on. Cara is giving a more detailed presentation on this model in another part of the conference. I urge you to review her presentation on that there. And a final strength of the models that we see is that they are there to help connect or scaffold more deeper explanatory theories. And I've taken an example here from my work of my PhD, where I was looking at theories operating in the cultural, agental and structural domain to explain the usage of positive models of sexual health services. And here I was interested in a historical perspective, and so they were used to identify changes and important changes in the context over time. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time now summing up and thinking about some ways forward. And essentially what we wanted to remind people were that models are abstract entities. They're representations of an underlying reality that we cannot know, and we'll only ever have a partial understanding of. But they might be useful in realist research for representing and explaining the phenomena, and specifically the phenomena which is under study. And this kind of leads us to put forward some recommendations. Models should be used with a real critical consciousness, and should be presented with recognition of their limitations, and made explicit their perspective and that of the users, and should always be accompanied with detailed, theoretically involved description of how cause may produce the effect. And we think with that critical reflection on models, then they can be extremely useful for not only helping research teams to develop ever more nuanced explanations of what's happening, but also to be able to share that information with a wider stakeholder base. So that concludes our presentation, and just to remind everybody that this was always intended to be a roundtable discussion. So we welcome questions and comments and further insight into how you've used models in realist research. I look forward to the debate going forward.